History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 5 The Making of Europe. In this world, possession of land and access to it was the supreme determinant of the social order. Somehow, slowly but logically, the great men of Western society, while continuing to be the warriors they had always been in barbarian societies, became landowners too. With the dignitaries of the church and their kings, they were the ruling class. From the possession of land came not only revenue by rent and taxation, but jurisdiction and labor services too. Landowners were the lords, and gradually their hereditary status was to loom larger, and their practical prowess and skill as warriors was to be less emphasized, though in theory it long persisted as the thing that made them noble. The lands of some of these men were granted to them by a king or a great prince. In return, they were expected to repay the favor by turning out, when required, to do him military service. Moreover, administration had to be decentralized after imperial times. Barbarian kings did not have the bureaucratic and literate resources to rule directly over great areas. Thus, the grant of exploitable economic goods in return for specific obligations of service was very common. And this idea was what lay at the heart of what lawyers, looking back at the European Middle Ages, later chose as a key to understanding them and called feudalism. It was a widespread but not universal phenomenon. Many tributaries flowed into it. Both Roman and Germanic custom favored the elaboration of such an idea. It helped too that in the latter days of the empire, or in the troubled times of Merovingian Gaul, it had become common for men to commend themselves to a great lord for protection. In return for his protection, they offered him a special loyalty and service. This was a usage easily assimilated to the practices of Germanic society. Under the Carolingians, the practice began of vassals of the king doing him homage. That is to say, they acknowledged with distinctive ceremonies, often public, their special responsibilities of service to him. He was their lord. They were his men. The old loyalties of the blood brotherhood of the warrior companions of the barbarian chief began to blend with the notions of commendation in a new moral ideal of loyalty, faithfulness, and reciprocal obligation. Vassals then bred vassals, and one lord's man was another man's lord. A chain of obligation and personal service might stretch in theory from the king down through his great men and their retainers to the lowest of the free. And of course, it might produce complicating and conflicting demands. A king could be another king's vassal in respect of some of his lands. Below, the free were the slaves, more numerous perhaps in southern Europe than in the northern, and everywhere showing a tendency to evolve marginally upwards in status to that of the serf, the unfree man born tied to the soil of his manor, but nevertheless not quite without rights of any kind. Some people later spoke as if the relationship of lord and the man could explain the whole of the medieval society. This was never so. Though much of the land of Europe was divided into fiefs, the feuda from which feudalism takes its name, which were holdings bearing obligation to a lord. There were always important areas, especially in Europe, where the mix of Germanic overlay and Roman background did not work out in the same way. Much of Italy, Spain, and southern France was not feudal in this sense. There were also always some freeholders, even in more feudal lands, an important class of men, more numerous in some countries than others, who owned no service for their lands but owned them outright. For the most part, nevertheless, contractual obligation based on land set the tone of medieval European civilization. Corporations, like men, might be lords or vassals. A tenant might do homage to the abbot of a monastery or the abbess of a nunnery. For the manor he held of its estates, and a king might have a cathedral chapter or a community of monks as one of his vassals. There was much room for complexity and ambiguity in the feudal order, but the central fact of an exchange of obligations between superior and inferior ran through the whole structure and does more than anything else to make it intelligible to modern eyes. Lord and man were bound to one another reciprocally. Serfs, obey your temporal lords with fear and trembling. Lords, treat your serfs according to justice and equity was a French cleric's injunction, which concisely summarized a principle in a specific case. On this rationalization rested a society of growing complexity, which it long proved able to interpret and sustain. It also justified the extraction from the peasant of the wherewithal to maintain the warrior and build his castle. From this grew the aristocracies of Europe. The military function of the system which supported them long remained paramount. Even when personal service in the field was not required, that of the vassal's fighting men and later of his money to pay fighting men would be. Of the military skills, that which was most esteemed, because it was the most effective, was that of fighting in armor on horseback. At some point in the 7th or 8th century, the stirrup was adopted. From that time, the armored horseman had it for the most part of his own way on the battlefield until the coming of weapons which could master him. From this technical superiority emerged the knightly class of professional cavalrymen, maintained by the lord either directly or by a grant of a manor to feed them and their horses. They were the source of the warrior aristocracy of the Middle Ages and of the European values for centuries to come. Yet for a long time, the boundaries of this class were ill-defined and movement into and out of it was common. Political realities often militiated against theory. In the intricate web of vassalage, a king might have less control over his own vassals than they over theirs. The great lord, whether lay magnate or local bishop, must always have loomed larger and more important in the life of the ordinary man than the remote and probably never seen king or prince. In the 10th and 11th centuries, there are everywhere examples of kings, obviously under pressure from great men. The country where this seemed to present the least trouble was Anglo-Saxon England, where monarchical tradition and a sense of nationhood were stronger than elsewhere. But pressure was not always effective against even a weak king if he were shrewd. He had, after all, other vassals, and if wise, he would not antagonize all of them at once. Furthermore, his office was unique. The anointing of the church confirmed its sacred, charismatic authority. Kings were set apart in the eyes of most men by the special pomp and ceremony which surrounded them and which played as important a part in medieval government as does bureaucratic paper in ours. If in addition a king had the advantage of large dominions of his own, then he stood an excellent chance of having his way. Not always in the technical and legal sense, but in common, everyday sense. Kings and great magnates were the only men who enjoyed much freedom in the early medieval society. Yet even they led lives cramped and confined by the absence of much that we take for granted. There was nothing much to do after all, except pray, fight, hunt, and run your estate. There were no professions for men to enter, except that of church, and small possibility of innovation in the style or content of daily life. Women's choices were even more restricted, and so they were for men as one went further down the social scale. Only with the gradual revival of trade and urban life, as the economy expanded, was this to change. Obviously, dividing lines are of almost no value in such matters. But it is not really until after 1100 that important economic expansion begins, and only then that we have the sense of moving out of a society still semi barbarous with pretensions to civilization, but no more, over much of the continent. Chapter 6 India. Though accompanied and advised by scholars and savants, Alexander the Great had only hazy ideas of what he would find in India. He seems to have thought that the Indus was part of the Nile and that beyond it lay more of Ethiopia. A fair amount had long been known by the Greeks about the Indian northwest, the seat of the Persian satrapy of Gandhara. But beyond that, all was darkness. So far as political geography is concerned, the obscurity has remained. The relations between, and for that matter, the nature of the states of the Ganges Valley at the time of Alexander's invasion are still hard to get at. A kingdom of Magadha, based on the lower river and exercising some sort of hegemony over the rest of the valley, had been the most important political unit in the subcontinent for 2 centuries or more, but not much is known about its institutions or history. Indian sources say nothing of Alexander's arrival in India, and as the great conqueror never penetrated beyond the Punjab, we can learn from Greek accounts of his day only of his disruption of the petty kingdoms of the northwest, not about the heartland of Indian power. Under the Seleucid, more reliable information came available in the west about what lay beyond the Punjab. This new knowledge roughly coincides with the rise of a new Indian power, the Maurya Empire. And here the India of historical record really begins. One of our informants is a Greek ambassador, Megasthenes, sent to India by the Seleucid king in about 300 BC. Fragments of his account of what he saw were preserved long enough for later writers to quote him at length, as he travelled as far as Bengal and Orissa and was respected both as a diplomat and a scholar. He met and interrogated many Indians. Some later writers found him a credulous and unreliable reporter. They dwelt upon his tales of men who subsisted on odors instead of food and drink, of others who were cyclopean, or whose feet were so large that they used them to shelter from the sun, of pygmies and men without mouths. Such tales were, of course, nonsense, but they were not necessarily without foundation. They may well represent only the highly developed awareness shown by Aryan Indians of the physical differences which marked them off from neighbors or remote acquaintances from Central Asia or the jungles of Burma. Some of these must have looked very strange indeed, and some of their behavior was no doubt also very strange in Indian eyes. Others among these tales may dimly reflect the curious ascetic practices of Indian religion, which have never ceased to impress outsiders and usually improve in the telling. Such tales need not discredit the teller, and they do not mean that other things he reports must be wholly untrue. They may even have a positive value if they suggest something of the way in which Megasthenes' Indian informants saw the outside world. He describes the India of a great ruler, Chandragupta, founder of the Maurya line. Something is known about him from other sources. The ancients believed that he had been inspired to conquest by having as a youth seen Alexander the Great during his invasion of India. However, this may be Chandragupta usurped the Magadha throne in 321 BC and on the ruins of that kingdom built a state which encompassed not only the two great valleys of the Indus and Ganges but most of Afghanistan, taken from Seleucids and Balochistan. His capital was Patna, where Chandragupta inhabited a magnificent palace. It was made of wood. Archaeology still cannot help us much at this stage of Indian history. From Megasthene's account, it might be inferred that Chandragupta exercised a sort of monarchical presidency, and Indian sources seem to reveal a bureaucratic state, or at least something that aspired to be one. What it was like in practice is hard to see. It had been built from political units formed in earlier times, many of which had been Republican or popular in organization, and many of these were connected to the emperor through great men who were his officers. Some of these nominally subjects must often have been very independent in practice. About the empire's inhabitants, too, Megasthenes is informative. Besides providing a long list of different peoples, he distinguished two religious traditions, one the Brahmanical and the other apparently Buddhist, mentioned the rice eating habits of the Indians and their abstention from wine except for ritual purposes, said much about the domestication of elephants, and remarked on the fact, surprising to Greek eyes, that in India there were no slaves. He was wrong, but excusably so. Though Indians were not bought and sold in absolute servitude, there were those bound to labor for their masters and legally incapable of removal. Megasthenes also reported that the king diverted himself by hunting, which was done from raised platforms or from the backs of the elephants, much as tigers were shot in the 20th century. Chandragupta is said to have spent his last days in retirement with Jains, ritually starving himself to death in a retreat near Mysore. His son and successor turned the expansive course of the empire, already shown by his father, to the south. Maurya power began to penetrate the dense rainforest of Patna and to push down the eastern coast. Finally, under the third Maurya, the conquest of Orissa gave the empire control of land and sea routes to the south, and the subcontinent acquired a measure of political unity not matched in extent for over 2,000 years. The conqueror who achieved this was Ashoka, the ruler under whom a documented history of India at last begins to be possible. From Ashoka's era survive many inscriptions bearing decrees and injunctions to his subjects. The use of this means of propagating official messages and the individual style of the inscriptions both suggest Persian and Hellenistic influence, and India under the Mauryas was certainly more continually in touch with the civilization to the west than ever before. At Kandahar, Ashoka left inscriptions in both Greek and Aramaic. Such evidence reveals a government capable of much more than sketched by Megasthenes. A royal council ruled over a society based on caste. There was a royal army and a bureaucracy. As elsewhere, the coming of literacy was an epoch in government as well as in culture. There seems also to have been a large secret police or internal intelligence service. Besides raising taxes and maintaining communication and irrigation services, this machine under Ashoka undertook the promotion of an official ideology. Ashoka had himself converted to Buddhism early in his reign. Unlike Constantine's conversion, his did not precede but followed a battle whose cost in suffering appalled Ashoka. Be that as it may, the result of his conversion was the abandonment of the pattern of conquest which had marked his career until then. Perhaps this is why he felt no temptation to campaign outside the subcontinent, a limitation which, however, he shared with most Indian rulers, who never aspired to rule over barbarians, and one which, of course, was only evident when he had completed the conquest of India. The most remarkable consequence of Ashoka's Buddhism has usually been thought to be expressed in the recommendations he made to his subjects in the rock inscriptions and pillars dating from this part of his reign, roughly after 260 BC. They really amounted to a complete new social philosophy. Ashoka's precepts have the overall name of Dhamma, a variant of a Sanskrit word meaning universal law, and their novelty has led to much anachronistic admiration of Ashoka's modernity by Indian politicians of this century. Ashoka's ideas are, nonetheless, striking. He enjoined respect for the dignity of all men, and above all, religious toleration and non-violence. His precepts were general rather than precise, and they were not laws. But their central themes are unmistakable, and they were intended to provide principles of action. While Ashoka's own bent and thinking undoubtedly made such ideas agreeable to him, they suggest less a wish to advance the ideas of Buddhism. This is something Ashoka did in other ways than a wish to allay differences. They look very much like a device of the government for a huge, heterogeneous, and religiously divided empire. Ashoka was seeking to establish some focus for a measure of political and social unity spanning all India, which would be based on men's interests as well as upon forces and spying. All men, said one of his inscriptions, are my children. This may also explain his pride in what might be called his social services, which sometimes took forms appropriate to the climate. On the roads, I have the banyan trees planted, he proclaimed, which will give shade to beasts and men. The value of this apparently simple device would have been readily apparent to those who toiled and travelled in the great Indian plains. Almost incidentally, improvements also smoothed the path of trade, but like the wells he dug and the rest houses he set up at 9-mile intervals, the banyan trees were an expression of Dhamma. Yet Dhamma does not appear to have succeeded, for we hear of sectarian struggles and the resentment of priests. Ashoka did better in promoting simple Buddhist evangelization. His reign brought the first great expansion of Buddhism, which had prospered and had remained hitherto confined to northeastern India. Now Ashoka sent missionaries to Burma who did well. In Ceylon, others did better still, and from his day, the island was predominantly Buddhist. Those sent more optimistically to Macedonia and Egypt were less successful, though Buddhist teachings left its mark on some of the philosophies of the Hellenistic world and some Greeks were converted. The vitality of Buddhism under Ashoka may in part explain signs of reaction in the Brahmanical religion. It had been suggested that a new popularization of certain cults, which dates from about this time, may have been a conscious Brahman response to challenge. Notably, the 3rd and 2nd century BCs brought a new prominence to the cults of two of the most popular avatars of Vishnu. One of the protoform, Krishna, whose legend offers vast possibilities of psychological identification to the worshipper, and the other, Rama, the embodiment of the benevolent king, good husband and son, a family god. It was in the 2nd century BC too that the two great Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, began to take their final form. The first of these was extended by a long passage, which is now the most famous work of Indian literature and its greatest poem, the Bhagavad Gita, or Song of the Lord. It was to become the central testament to Hinduism, weaving around the figure of Vishnu or Krishna, the ethical doctrine of duty in the performance of the obligations laid upon one by membership of one's class, dharma, and the recommendation that works of devotion, however meritorious, might be less efficacious than love of Krishna as a means to release into eternal happiness. These were important facts for the future of Hinduism, but were to develop fully only over a period which ran on far past the crumbling of the Mauryan Empire, which began soon after Ashoka's death. Such a disappearance is so dramatically impressive, and the Mauryan Empire had been so remarkable a thing, that though we are tempted to look for some special explanation, yet perhaps there is only a cumulative one. In all ancient empires, except perhaps Chinese, the demands made on the government eventually outgrew the technical resources available to meet them. When this happened, they broke up. The Mauryas had done great things. They conscripted labor to exploit large areas of wasteland, thereby both feeding a growing population and increasing the tax base of the empire. They undertook great irrigation works which survived them for centuries. Trade prospered under Maurya rule, if we may judge from the way northern pottery spread throughout India in the 3rd century BC. They kept up a huge army and a diplomacy which ranged as far afield as Epirus. The cost, however, was great. The government and army were parasitical upon an agricultural economy, which could not be indefinitely expanded. There was a limit to what it could pay for. Nor, though bureaucracy seems at this distance to have been centralized in principle, was it likely to have been very effective, let alone flawless, without a system of control and recruitment to render it independent of society. It fell at one end into the hands of the favorites of the monarch on whom all else depended, and at the other into the gift of local elites who knew how to seize and retain power. One political weakness was rooted deep in pre Maurya times. Indian society had already sunk its anchor in the family and institutions of caste. Here, in social institutions rather than in a dynasty or an abstract notion of a continuing state, let alone a nation, was the focus of Indian loyalties. When an Indian empire began to crumble under economic, external, or technical pressures, it had no unthinking popular support to fall back upon. This is a striking indication of lack of success of Ashoka's attempts to provide ideological integument for his empire. What is more, India's social institutions and especially caste, in its elaborated forms, imposed economic costs. Where functions were inalterably allocated by birth, economic aptitude was held back. So was ambition. India had a social system which was bound to cramp the possibilities of economic growth. The assassination of the last Maurya was followed by a Genghis dynasty of Brahmanical origin, and thereafter the story of India for 500 years is once more one of political disunity. References in Chinese sources become available from the end of the 2nd century BC, but it cannot be said that they have made agreement between scholars about what was happening in India any easier. Even the chronology is still largely conjecture. Only the general processes stand out. The most important of these is a new succession of invasions of India from the historic northwestern routes. First came Bactrians, descendants of the Greeks left behind by Alexander's empire on the Upper Oxus, where by 239 BC they had performed an independent kingdom standing between India and Seleucid Persia. Our knowledge of this mysterious realm is largely drawn from its coins and has grave gaps in it. But it is known that 100 years later, the Bactrians were pushing into the Indus Valley. They were the foremost in a current which was to flow for 4 centuries. A complex series of movements was in train whose origins lay deep in the nomadic societies of Asia. Among those who followed the Indo-Greeks of Bactria and established themselves at different times in the Punjab were Parthians and Scythians. One Scythian king, according to the legend, received Saint Thomas the Apostle at his court. One important people came all the way from the borders of China and left behind them the memory of another big Indian empire, stretching from Benares beyond the mountains to the caravan routes of the steppes. These were the Kushanas. Historians still argue about how they are related to other nomadic peoples, but 2 things about them seem clear enough. The first is that they or their rulers were both enthusiastically Buddhist and also patronized some Hindu sects. The second was their political interests were focused in Central Asia, where their greatest king died fighting.